Somewhere in the Bay of Bengal, on the night of November 15th, 2018, a wooden fishing boat cut its engine and drifted the last few hundred meters in total silence. No lights, no radio, no permission. The men on board weren't smugglers, and they weren't pirates. They were ordinary fishermen who had been paid, quietly and generously, to do something the Indian government had made a crime: sail within sight of North Sentinel Island. On board with them sat a 26-year-old American, hunched over a dry bag, checking it for the third time that hour. Inside, a GoPro, a football, a small bag of dried fish, a pair of scissors, some fishing line, and a waterproof Bible. He believed with total conviction that in a few hours he would make history. He believed he'd been chosen for this. He believed God was walking beside him toward a beach that had swallowed every stranger who ever tried to reach it. By morning, he'd be crouched in a kayak, paddling the last stretch alone, watching a white sandbar and a wall of green jungle grow larger with every stroke. Somewhere behind that tree line, people who had never seen a stranger's face and lived were about to see his. He was wrong on almost every count. But here's the question worth sitting with before we go any further. How does a young man from Washington State end up risking and ultimately losing his life for a patch of jungle roughly the size of Manhattan, guarded by people who have never once, in over 100 documented encounters across 2.5 centuries, welcomed an outsider? To understand what happened to him, we don't start with him. We start 10,000 years earlier, with people who made a decision so absolute that it has outlasted empires, world wars, and the moon landing. This is the story of the only place on Earth where the 21st century is simply not allowed to happen. Think about what that actually means for a second. We live in a world where satellites can read a license plate from orbit, where every square meter of land has been mapped, taxed, zoned, or claimed by someone. And yet here is a piece of that same planet, inside a country of 1.4 billion people, where the government's official policy is, don't look, don't approach, don't even try. Not because they can't, because they've learned, at a devastating cost, that trying is the one thing that gets people killed, on both sides. The fishermen who ferried Chau that night weren't naive either. They'd grown up hearing stories about this island their entire lives, the way children elsewhere grow up hearing about haunted houses. Except every version of this story was true. They took his money, dropped him near the edge of the exclusion zone, and waited offshore, watching a young man paddle toward a beach that had never once in recorded history let an uninvited visitor leave the way they arrived. Here's a detail that breaks people's assumptions immediately. North Sentinel Island is not remote in the way we usually imagine uncontacted to mean. It sits roughly 50 kilometers from Port Blair, the modern capital of India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands, a city with fiber internet, 5-star resorts, and an international airport. You could, in theory, see this island's tree line from a boat that left a Wi-Fi-connected hotel lobby an hour earlier. It's small, about 60 square kilometers, roughly the footprint of a mid-sized town, ringed by coral reefs sharp enough to gut a steel-hulled ship. Thick jungle runs almost to the waterline, giving anyone approaching from the sea exactly one usable vantage point to see what's coming, which, not coincidentally, is also the vantage point the island's residents use to see you. Out of 572 islands in the Andaman and Nicobar chain, only 38 have any human settlement at all, and tourists are permitted on a small handful. North Sentinel isn't one of them. It's not just unpopular with visitors. It's protected by Indian law with a hard exclusion zone that patrol boats are ordered to enforce, and getting caught within it can mean prison time. Nobody knows exactly how many people live inside that tree line. Estimates swing wildly, anywhere from 50 to 200, because no census taker has ever been allowed to count them, and no satellite photo can see under jungle canopy. What we do know comes from a handful of tense encounters stretched across 250 years, most of which ended the same way: warning shots, real arrows, and a hurried retreat. So who are they? And why, when the rest of the human species spread out, mixed, traded, and built cities, did these people choose the opposite of all of it? There's another detail that rarely makes it into the headlines. The exclusion zone isn't just a courtesy line drawn by a sympathetic government. It's enforced with real teeth. Indian Navy patrol vessels run scheduled sweeps of the surrounding waters. Fishing boats caught drifting too close have been detained and fined. Filming the coastline from a distance, even with a drone, can trigger criminal charges under India's Aboriginal Tribes Regulation Act. In a country where bureaucracy moves at the speed you'd expect from 1.4 billion people and endless paperwork, this is one policy that gets enforced without exception, without hesitation, and without appeal. And yet, despite all of that legal machinery, the tribe's actual defense has never once depended on India's navy. For 250 years, the only security force that has ever mattered on that beach has been a few dozen men with bows made from island wood, and it has never lost. Even satellite imagery, the one tool that theoretically could answer every question we have about this place without anyone setting foot on the sand, gives up almost nothing. High-resolution images do show scattered clearings and the faint outlines of paths cut through the canopy, but the jungle canopy itself is thick enough that entire settlements can sit completely hidden from anything orbiting above. Researchers studying the available imagery have spent years arguing over population estimates based on nothing more than how many clearings they can count and how large those clearings appear to be. An entire field of scholarship built on educated guesswork, because guesswork is all that's permitted. To find the answer, rewind the clock about 60,000 years. Modern humans were just beginning to leave Africa in scattered waves, following coastlines because coastlines meant food, fresh water, and a route that didn't require crossing deserts or mountain ranges cold enough to kill them. One of those waves hugged the shoreline of the Arabian Peninsula, curved along the coast of what is now India, and eventually reached a chain of islands in the Bay of Bengal. From those earliest arrivals came several distinct groups: the Onga, the Jarawa, the Great Andamanese, and the Sentinelese. Genetically, they're some of the most isolated human populations that have ever been studied, direct descendants of people who made this crossing before agriculture existed anywhere on the planet, before anyone had domesticated a single animal, before writing, before the wheel. Here's the twist. Almost every other branch of that original migration eventually reconnected with the wider world. Trade routes reached them. Colonizers reached them. Disease, war, and assimilation reached them. The Great Andamanese population, for example, was decimated by contact with British colonizers in the 19th century, reduced from thousands to a few dozen survivors within a few generations. The Sentinelese watched all of that happen to their neighbors. Across the water, close enough that their smoke could probably be seen from other islands, one tribe made a different choice. Nobody comes in, and nobody goes out. 10,000 years passed. Empires rose in Egypt, Rome, and China. Humans built the pyramids, split the atom, and walked on the moon. On this one island, life continued almost exactly as it had at the very beginning. Hunting with wooden bows, fishing with handmade nets. No farming, no metal tools until they scavenged some by accident, and absolutely no contact with anyone who wasn't already inside the tribe. The question that should be nagging at you right now isn't, how did they survive this way? It's, what did they see in those first encounters with outsiders that convinced them this was the only way to survive at all? Genetic studies on related Andamanese populations have found DNA markers so old and so distinct that some researchers consider them a living link to the very first wave of humans who ever left Africa. A population that branched off so early it predates the genetic lineages of most of Europe and Asia combined. If that's accurate, then talking to a Sentinelese elder wouldn't just be talking to a stranger from a different culture. It would be closer to opening a direct line to the earliest chapters of the human story, still being lived in real time, a few dozen miles from an airport. That's part of what makes their isolation so scientifically precious, and part of what makes every reckless attempt at contact so much more than just a personal risk. Anthropologists have pointed out, with real anxiety in their voices, that we may be a single bad decision away from losing something that took 10,000 years to preserve and can never, ever be rebuilt once it's gone. Compare their trajectory to their closest neighbors for a moment, because the contrast is what makes this story so unsettling. The Great Andamanese, once numbering in the thousands across several distinct tribes, were pacified by British colonizers through a mix of forced settlement, disease, and cultural erosion. Today, only a small handful of speakers of their original languages remain, and several of those languages are already extinct, preserved only in old linguistic recordings. The Jarowaw, who resisted contact for far longer, were eventually drawn into limited interaction after a young tribesman was found injured near a settlement in the 1990s. And even that comparatively gentle bridge has brought outside diseases, alcohol dependency, and exploitation by tourists on nearby roads who treat the Jarowaw Reserve like a human safari. Every one of those outcomes was, at some point, framed as progress. Every one of them also permanently altered or ended a way of life that had survived since the last ice age. The Sentinelese watched enough of that unfold across the water to draw their own conclusion, long before anyone in the outside world understood they were even paying attention. The fear didn't start in 2018. It's been written down for close to 2,000 years. In the 2nd century, the Roman geographer Claudius Ptolemy charted a region of the Bay of Bengal and labeled it in Latin roughly as the Islands of Cannibals. He never pinned a name to a specific island. Geography at the time was closer to guesswork stitched together from sailors' rumors. But scholars who've studied the description note how closely his account of a violent, isolated people matches everything recorded about this stretch of water ever since. 500 years later, a Chinese Buddhist monk named Yi Jing crossed the same waters on a pilgrimage and wrote home about the Andaman Islands with a near-identical warning. Dangerous, hostile, best avoided entirely. Then, in the 13th century, came the account most people have actually heard of. Marco Polo, describing this same region in his travels, wrote that any stranger unlucky enough to land here would be seized and eaten. Modern historians treat all three accounts with real skepticism. Ptolemy and Marco Polo were both working from second-hand sailor stories, and Cannibal Island was a common trope used to describe anywhere unfamiliar and hostile, applied liberally across dozens of unfamiliar coastlines from West Africa to the Pacific by writers who never set foot on any of them. There's no solid evidence the Sentinelese ever practiced cannibalism at all. The label likely says far more about how medieval and ancient writers processed the fear of the unknown than it does about anything that actually happened on this specific beach. But strip away the exaggeration, and one thing remains consistent across 2,000 years of completely unconnected sources, written in different languages, on different continents, centuries apart. Everyone who came near this island came back with the same conclusion. Don't land here. Whoever lives here does not want you, and will make you understand that immediately. That reputation kept the island essentially untouched by outsiders for another 500 years, until one ship's crew, sailing past in the dead of night, got the first hard proof that people were actually there. It's worth pausing here on something historians rarely emphasize enough. For almost the entire span of recorded human civilization, through the fall of Rome, the spread of Islam, the rise and collapse of dynasties across Asia, the Crusades, the Renaissance, this island appears in the historical record only as a rumor whispered between sailors who never dared find out if it was true. No merchant fleet mapped it properly. No empire annexed it. No missionary reached its shore. While the rest of the known world was being drawn, redrawn, conquered, and renamed on 1,000 different maps, this one patch of jungle simply sat outside of history altogether, protected by nothing but its own terrifying reputation. 1771. A British East India Company survey ship called the Diligent was mapping the waters of the Bay of Bengal, using the cover of darkness to plot coastlines more precisely by lantern sight. As it passed North Sentinel, the crew logged something that, on paper, sounds almost mundane, but changed everything. Scattered along the tree line, deep in the jungle interior, fires. Multiple, deliberate, clearly tended. This was the first officially documented written confirmation that human beings actually lived on this island. Before this, everything was rumor, folklore, second-hand fear passed sailor to sailor. Now, there was a logbook entry. The exact moment 2 millennia of vague, half-believed sailors' tales hardened into something a mapmaker could actually mark with confidence. And yet, nobody on that ship set foot on the beach. The stories had done their job too well. The crew noted the fires, kept their distance, and sailed on into the dark. For the next 100 years, the island went quiet again in the historical record. No landings, no further sightings worth writing down, just an unconfirmed, unexplored dot of land that mariners were content to leave exactly as they found it, mysterious and firmly on the do not approach side of every map. That silence wouldn't last. In 1867, the ocean itself would force the issue in the most violent way possible. There's something almost eerie about how deliberately that first log entry was written. The captain of the Diligent wasn't a storyteller looking to spice up his report. Survey ship logs of that era were dry, factual, meant purely for cartography. Fires meant nothing more or less than inhabited land, mark accordingly. But to modern readers, knowing everything that came after, that flat procedural sentence reads like the opening line of a horror story nobody involved yet understood they were writing. Picture this. You've just survived a shipwreck. Your vessel has torn itself apart on hidden coral reefs. You've swum, exhausted and half-drowned, to the only land in sight. You claw your way onto a beach, and for one brief moment, you feel something like relief. That relief lasted about as long as it took the sun to rise. In the summer of 1867, an Indian merchant vessel called the Nineveh struck the reef surrounding North Sentinel Island and broke apart. 86 passengers and 20 crew members, 106 people in total, managed to swim to shore. At first light, the jungle came alive. Dozens of Sentinelese warriors emerged from the tree line and, without any attempt at communication, opened fire with arrows and hurled stones at the shipwreck survivors camped on the beach. Think about what that means for a moment. These weren't soldiers or armed raiders. They were shipwrecked civilians, already at the edge of survival, now fighting for their lives a second time, with nothing but sticks and rocks, against an enemy who had home field advantage in every possible sense. They held out just long enough. A British Royal Navy vessel happened to be in the area and arrived before the situation turned into a massacre, evacuating the survivors before things escalated further. Survivor accounts collected afterward described a chaotic, days-long standoff, rather than a single quick skirmish. The shipwrecked group built a rough barricade out of wreckage and debris, rationed whatever food had washed ashore with them, and took turns keeping watch through the night, never certain whether the next attack would come from the tree line or from the sea that had already tried to kill them once. Children were reportedly kept in the center of the makeshift camp, shielded on every side by adults, a detail that underscores just how seriously this group of ordinary merchants and passengers understood the danger they were in. This wasn't a skirmish they could simply wait out. For the British Empire, an institution that at the time controlled roughly a quarter of the planet, this incident landed like a slap. Here was a scrap of land technically inside their colonial territory, and their laws, their navy, and their entire imperial machinery meant absolutely nothing to the people living on it. That wound to imperial pride wouldn't stay unanswered for long. 13 years later, one British officer decided he was going to fix that, and in so doing, he'd create a scar the Sentinelese would carry for generations. Put yourself in the shoes of those 106 survivors for a moment. They'd already faced death once, in the water, fighting a shipwreck and drowning. They crawled onto sand thinking the worst was over, and instead discovered they'd traded one death sentence for a different one, this time with a face attached to it. Survivors who gave later accounts described the horror less as fear of dying and more as a specific kind of disorientation. They had done everything right, reached solid ground, and it changed nothing. He loaded them with gifts and clothing and dumped them back on the beach he'd taken them from, hoping to erase the evidence of what he'd done. Here's the part almost nobody talks about, and it's the darkest twist in the entire story. Those 4 children, sent home sick, may have carried the very disease that killed the elderly couple straight back into their village. An island that had survived completely disease-free for 10,000 years may have suffered its first epidemic because of a kidnapping designed to help them. From that moment forward, the equation the Sentinelese carried into every future encounter was set in stone. Outsider means disease. Outsider means death. Not as superstition, as observed, repeated fact. There's a detail in Portman's own writing that historians find chilling in hindsight. He documented the children's decline almost clinically, noting symptoms and treating the entire episode as a regrettable but minor setback in an otherwise successful expedition. He faced no consequences. He continued his colonial career, made further trips into Andamanese territory, and to this day remains a symbol, taught in Indian anthropology courses, of exactly how contact between an industrialized power and an isolated population can turn fatal even when nobody intends it to. Intent, in this story, has never mattered nearly as much as consequence. 16 years later, that fact would be written in blood one more time. 1896. Deep in the Andaman Islands sat one of the British Empire's most feared penal colonies. A prison so notorious it was nicknamed Kalapani, the Black Water. A place convicts spoke of the way people speak of hell. Political prisoners and hardened criminals alike were shipped there from mainland India, thousands of kilometers from home, into cells specifically designed to break the will of anyone who tried to escape by sheer isolation alone. The ocean itself was supposed to be the final wall. Nobody was meant to survive a crossing to freedom through waters this unpredictable. One prisoner escaped. He stole a small wooden boat and rowed out into open water, believing, for the first time in years, that he might actually be free. The current carried him directly onto the shore of North Sentinel Island. Days later, a British patrol searching for the escapee reached the island and found what they were looking for on the white sand: a body. His throat had been cut. His body was riddled with arrows. There was no ambiguity about what had happened, and no mystery about the message it sent. This wasn't a place you escaped to. It was a place you escaped from, if you were lucky enough to escape at all. For decades after this, the British largely gave up. The island sat in silence, avoided by sailors, ignored by administrators, left almost entirely alone, until an independent India inherited both the territory and the question nobody had solved. What do you actually do with a people who have made it unmistakably clear they want nothing from you? The escaped convict's death carries a bitter irony worth sitting with. Kalapani, the prison he fled, was infamous specifically because prisoners considered death preferable to serving out their sentence there. He risked everything for a shot at freedom, and the ocean currents delivered him, entirely by chance, to a shore that turned out to be even less forgiving than the prison he'd escaped. In a story full of outsiders who chose to approach this island, he remains the only one who never chose it at all. Just a man running from one form of captivity, who drowned instead in someone else's fiercely guarded freedom. The answer, when it finally came in the 20th century, would look completely different from anything tried before. By 1967, India had a new approach. Instead of soldiers and captors, send scientists. The Anthropological Survey of India, led by anthropologist T.N. Pandit, launched an expedition with one goal: establish peaceful contact, patiently, on the tribe's own terms. When the team's boat approached the island, they found the shoreline eerily empty. No warriors waiting, no warning shots, just silence. They made a decision no expedition had dared before. They went inland. Roughly a kilometer through dense jungle, they discovered something extraordinary: a settlement of 18 huts, each with a carefully maintained fire pit ringed in stones, hunting tools and pottery scattered around, like the residents had simply stepped out. Nobody was home. But for the first time, the outside world had direct physical evidence of exactly how the Sentinelese lived day to day. The team left gifts on the beach and withdrew. This became the pattern for years afterward. Boats would leave coconuts, cloth, and metal tools on the sand, retreat to a safe distance, and watch the tribe emerge from the tree line to collect them once the boat was far enough away. Acceptance of the gifts, though, never meant acceptance of the people offering them. Bows stayed raised. Warnings stayed constant. Over the years, the contact team developed something like an informal etiquette, learned entirely through trial and near-fatal error. Certain gifts were embraced instantly. Coconuts, in particular, became something close to a universal currency of goodwill, since the island itself grows none, and the tribe apparently developed a genuine taste for them. Metal tools and cookware were prized, likely because working metal by hand without smelting knowledge would otherwise be impossible. But other offerings triggered confusion or open hostility. Clothing was frequently discarded or destroyed, and anything resembling a weapon, even a harmless toy, could provoke exactly the reaction you'd expect if you handed a stranger something that looked like it might be used against them. At one point, Pandit's team brought along a member of the neighboring Onge tribe, hoping a fellow islander could translate. It didn't work. The Sentinelese language turned out to be unintelligible to every other tribe in the region, a linguistic island as isolated as the physical one, suggesting a separation stretching back further than anyone could estimate. The lesson from this era was subtle but important. These were not people who didn't understand what was being offered. They understood perfectly. They simply hadn't decided, yet, whether any of it was worth the risk of what came with it. That patience and that risk was about to be tested on camera in front of the entire world. T.N. Pandit himself would go on to lead or take part in dozens of these gift-giving missions across the following 2 decades, becoming, almost by accident, the single human being who spent more documented time observing the Sentinelese at close range than anyone else in history. In later interviews, long after retiring, he described the strange emotional whiplash of the work.
Moments of what felt like genuine curiosity and even warmth from individual tribespeople, followed almost immediately by a raised bow the second anyone misjudged the invisible line between welcome and threat. He never claimed to have gained their trust. He only ever claimed to have gained their tolerance. And even that, he said, could evaporate in a single afternoon.
In 1974, a National Geographic film crew arrived to shoot a documentary titled Man in Search of Man. This wasn't a quiet anthropological visit. It came with armed police escort, camera crews, and T.N. Pandit once again as guide. As their boat neared the shore, tribespeople emerged from the jungle. The crew waved, trying to signal peaceful intent. The response was immediate, a volley of arrows. The boat pulled back. When the warriors also stepped back from the water's edge, the crew rushed forward just long enough to leave an unusual pile of gifts on the sand. Coconuts, a toy car, aluminum cookware, a child's doll, and, strangely, a live pig tied with rope. The tribe returned, but instead of collecting the gifts peacefully, they attacked again, and this time an arrow struck the documentary's director, Prem Vaidya, directly in the thigh. Witnesses reported the archer who hit him sat calmly under a tree afterward, laughing as if he'd just won a contest. What happened to the gifts themselves is almost more revealing than the attack. The live pig was killed on the spot with spears. The doll had its nose and ears cut off before being buried in the sand, a gesture that reads, even now, like a deliberate act of rejection rather than confusion. And yet the metal cookware and coconuts were kept, carried off into the jungle with what onlookers described as visible enthusiasm. Read that again. They didn't reject everything from the outside world. They were making choices, accepting what was useful, mutilating and burying what felt threatening or symbolic in a way we still don't fully understand. For the first time, footage of the Sentinelese reached television screens around the planet. The world finally had a face, several faces, to put to 2,000 years of rumor. Watch that footage today, and one detail stands out more than the violence: the sheer confidence of it. These weren't people cowering from technology they didn't understand. They moved toward armed police escorts and film equipment with the calm of people entirely certain of their own advantage. August 1981. A cargo ship named the MV Primrose, sailing from Bangladesh to Australia, was caught in violent seas and driven onto the jagged reefs surrounding North Sentinel Island, roughly 100 meters from shore. The 31 crew members made a decision that, in hindsight, may have saved their lives. They stayed on the ship rather than attempting to reach land. It was the right call. Dozens of tribesmen soon gathered on the beach, armed with spears and bows, and began attacking the stranded vessel from a distance. The captain radioed for help, but the same storm pinning them to the reef was keeping rescue boats away. For nearly a week, the crew survived by posting round-the-clock watches and firing flare guns to keep the Sentinelese at bay, until an Indian helicopter finally arrived on August 2nd and airlifted every single crew member to safety. The Primrose itself never left. Its rusting hull remained wedged on the reef for years, visible even now as a ghostly outline on satellite maps, a landmark warning to anyone who studies the coastline before getting any closer. Modern researchers browsing satellite imagery still use the wreck as a reference point, a fixed, man-made scar on an otherwise untouched coastline that instantly orients anyone trying to study the island from above without ever risking a landing. Here's the twist that changed the tribe's material culture forever. The Sentinelese salvaged iron from the wreck. Scrap metal from a stranded cargo ship became the raw material for a new generation of arrowheads and spear points, sharper, deadlier, and more durable than anything they'd made from wood and stone. A shipwreck meant to carry goods from one modern port to another instead became the moment a Stone Age tribe entered, quite literally, the Iron Age, on their own terms, using scraps we accidentally left behind. There's something almost poetic and more than a little unsettling about how that transition happened. Every previous attempt to bring the Sentinelese into the modern era, Portman's kidnapping, National Geographic's gift baskets, decades of coconuts left on the sand, had failed to change anything about how they lived. Then a shipwreck nobody planned, caused by nothing more than bad weather, handed them exactly the upgrade centuries of deliberate contact never could. It's a reminder that this tribe was never rejecting technology itself. They were rejecting the people offering it, and the strings that always seemed to come attached. But the next major encounter wouldn't be defined by weapons at all. It would be defined by trust, and by one woman who refused to be afraid. January 4th, 1991. An Indian government vessel, the MV Tarmugli, approached North Sentinel Island carrying a team led by S. Awaradi, Director of Tribal Welfare, and, for the first time, a female anthropologist named Madhumala Chattopadhyay. The shoreline was quiet at first. Then, as it always did, the jungle produced warriors, bows raised, ready. The team held their distance and began tossing coconuts into the water, letting the current carry them toward shore. For a while, the Sentinelese simply watched. Then, cautiously, some waded in to collect them. On a second approach, something had changed. The tribe was already waiting at the water's edge, calling out in a rhythmic chant that sounded, to the team, like a request for more. This time, the boat came closer. Coconuts were handed almost directly across the gap. Then, without warning, a young Sentinelese man drew his bow and aimed it squarely at Madhumala. For a moment, the entire scene froze. Every instinct would say, "Retreat immediately." Instead, she held his gaze and gestured calmly toward the coconuts, refusing to break eye contact or show fear. He fired anyway. But a Sentinelese woman standing near him shoved him hard enough to throw off his aim, and the arrow missed, striking the water instead. Nobody knows for certain why she did it. Protectiveness, curiosity. Some read of the situation the rest of her tribe hadn't reached yet. But it was enough. Madhumala and her team made the boldest decision of the entire expedition. They stepped out of the boat and stood in open water, placing coconuts directly into Sentinelese hands. Think about the image for a second. On one side, a species that had already landed spacecraft on the moon. On the other, people living almost exactly as humans did before the invention of agriculture. And for one afternoon, in chest-deep water off a beach nobody was supposed to approach, the distance between those two timelines closed to almost nothing. Team members present that day later described the shift in atmosphere as almost physical. The tension that had defined every prior encounter with this tribe, stretching back over a century, seemed to loosen for the first time anyone could remember. Nobody let their guard down completely, but for a handful of minutes, something that looked, at least on the surface, like ordinary human trust passed between two groups separated by roughly 10,000 years of divergent history. 6 weeks later, on a follow-up visit, the tribe came to the boat on their own, without hesitation, to collect coconuts by hand. A photograph from that encounter still circulates today as one of the most remarkable images in the history of anthropology, proof that patience and restraint had done something spears, guns, and centuries of force never managed. It should have been the beginning of a real relationship. Instead, it became the reason the Indian government made its most consequential decision yet, one that would end contact permanently. Madhumala Chattopadhyay rarely gets the recognition she deserves in most retellings of this story, overshadowed by the more dramatic, more violent chapters surrounding her. But anthropologists studying isolated peoples still point to her 1991 expedition as a case study in exactly how contact should be approached when it happens at all. No weapons carried, no attempt to overpower or outlast the tribe's hesitation, just repeated, low-pressure gestures of goodwill extended patiently enough that trust, however brief and fragile, had room to form on its own. It worked precisely because nobody demanded that it work. Every account since, Portman's kidnapping, Chau's Bible, failed for the opposite reason. Here's the twist nobody expects. After decades of trying to reach the Sentinelese, the Indian government's ultimate conclusion was to stop trying entirely, and to actively prevent anyone else from trying too. Scientists and policymakers looked at everything that had happened since Portman's kidnapping in 1880 and reached an uncomfortable realization. Every act of contact, even the gentlest, carried a hidden cost the tribe couldn't consent to. Exposure to diseases their immune systems had never encountered. A single cold, flu, or measles outbreak could wipe out a population that might number in the dozens. By the early 2000s, India formally abandoned its contact expeditions and instead built a legal wall around the island. Boats are barred from approaching within several nautical miles. Coast Guard patrols monitor the exclusion zone around the clock. Photography, filming, and landing are criminal offenses. The science behind that decision is more sobering than most people realize. Populations that have been isolated for thousands of generations don't just lack immunity to specific diseases. Their immune systems have never been exposed to the broad categories of pathogens that circulate constantly through connected populations. Epidemiologists studying historical contact events elsewhere in the world, from the Americas to the Pacific Islands, have documented mortality rates from initial contact diseases running as high as 80 or 90% in some isolated communities. Not from any single catastrophic illness, but from ordinary infections like measles, influenza, and even the common cold, working through a population with zero prior defense. Given a Sentinelese population that may be as small as 50 people, a single infected visitor could, in the most extreme scenario, end the tribe's entire existence within a matter of weeks. This wasn't retreat. It was protection. The recognition that the kindest thing the modern world could do for the Sentinelese was, finally, leave them completely alone.
That policy was tested in the most brutal way possible in January 2006, when two Indian fishermen, Sundar Raj and Pandit Tiwari, drifted too close to the island after their boat's anchor failed to hold overnight. They were killed on the beach. When a helicopter attempted to recover their bodies, it was driven back by arrows before it could even get close. Their remains, like so many before them, were never retrieved. The law had a reason. The 2006 killings proved with brutal clarity exactly what that reason was.
What makes the 2006 case so haunting is how ordinary the circumstances were. Sundar Raj and Pandit Tiwari weren't explorers, missionaries, or thrill-seekers chasing a story. They were working fishermen, anchored illegally for the night to poach mud crabs in restricted waters, a minor, almost mundane infraction repeated by fishing crews across that region for generations. Their anchor simply failed to hold in rough current, and the tide did the rest, carrying their boat onto the one shoreline in the entire ocean where a navigational mistake carries a death sentence. There was no ideology in their story, no grand mission, no letter to loved ones justifying the risk. Just two men doing an ordinary, illegal, faintly reckless job, and paying a price that had nothing to do with what they were actually trying to do. Which brings the story full circle to a missionary who knew every one of these facts and decided none of them applied to him. John Allen Chau wasn't ignorant of any of this history. He'd researched North Sentinel Island for years. He knew about the exclusion zone, the 2006 killings, the disease risk, the 200-year pattern of arrows meeting every boat that approached. He knew, and he went anyway. He believed he had a divine calling, that this specific island, the single most isolated, most violently protected place on earth, was where God wanted him to deliver Christianity. In his own journal, he called it Satan's last stronghold, a place that needed the gospel more urgently than anywhere else on the planet, precisely because it had resisted every previous attempt at outside contact. Chau wasn't a spontaneous thrill-seeker either. That's part of what makes the story so much more unsettling than a simple case of reckless tourism. He'd trained specifically for this mission, studying missionary linguistics, taking wilderness survival and medical courses, and even spending time quarantining himself before the trip to reduce any chance he might carry a common illness onto the island. A precaution that reveals he understood the disease risk perfectly well and decided to manage it rather than let it stop him. He'd previously traveled to South Africa and other remote regions on missionary trips, building toward what he described in private writings as his life's central purpose. To him, North Sentinel wasn't a reckless afternoon decision. It was the culmination of years of preparation aimed at exactly this one impossible target. He bribed local fishermen to smuggle him past Coast Guard patrols under cover of darkness. His first landing attempt, on November 15, 2018, ended almost as soon as it began. Two armed tribesmen emerged from the jungle, bows drawn, and Chau retreated to his kayak before arrows were loosed. He went back that same day. This time, roughly half a dozen warriors met him, one standing on a rock wearing a crown of white flowers, shouting in a language Chau couldn't understand. He tried singing hymns as an offering. A child emerged from the tree line and fired an arrow without warning, striking the Bible held against his chest.
The impact knocked him backward. The metal arrowhead lodged in the book and snapped off. Without that Bible absorbing the impact, the arrow would very likely have gone through his heart. He swam back to the fishing boat and spent the next 2 days in what his own writing described as spiritual torment, torn between the near certainty of death and the conviction that abandoning the mission would be a failure of faith. He wrote a letter to his parents, apologizing in advance, asking that the Sentinelese not be blamed for whatever happened to him, and insisting that reaching them was worth the risk of his own life. On November 16, 2018, he went in one final time. The fishermen watching from a distance say they saw him approach the beach, and then saw the tribe kill him and drag his body to bury it in the sand. Indian authorities attempted multiple times to recover his remains. Every attempt was turned back by the same defense that has protected this island for 250 years. As far as anyone knows, John Chau is still buried exactly where he fell, the latest name on a list that stretches back to a Roman geographer's warning almost 2,000 years earlier. His death reopened a debate that has never really been settled, not about the tribe, but about us. Was he a martyr who died for a conviction he believed in more than he believed in his own safety? Or was he, as many anthropologists and even some fellow missionaries argued at the time, someone whose certainty about his own righteousness blinded him to the basic fact that his visit could have introduced a pathogen capable of wiping out an entire, irreplaceable culture, regardless of whether a single Sentinelese arrow ever found him? Both readings sit uncomfortably close together, and neither one erases the other. What's not up for debate is the outcome. One more grave on a beach that has never, in 250 years of trying, allowed a single uninvited visitor to leave the way they came.
Step back from the arrows, the shipwrecks, and the missionary, and a much bigger question comes into focus. What exactly has this tribe been fighting so hard to preserve? Not gold, not land in any strategic sense. 60 square kilometers of jungle has no resources anyone particularly wants. What the Sentinelese have defended, arrow by arrow, shipwreck by shipwreck, kidnapping by kidnapping, is something much simpler and much rarer. The right to remain exactly who they've always been, on their own terms, without anyone else's permission required. Every outsider who ever reached that beach, the shipwrecked sailors of the Nineveh, the kidnapped children Portman dragged back to Port Blair, the film crew with their doomed pig and mutilated doll, John Chau with his waterproof Bible, represented the same offer, dressed differently each time. Come join the modern world, whether you asked for it or not. 250 years of recorded encounters carry the same answer, delivered the only way that's ever actually worked: no. We tend to call societies like this primitive, measuring them against space travel and smartphones and skyscrapers. But by the one metric that arguably matters most to any group of people, surviving on your own terms for 10,000 uninterrupted years against empires, diseases, kidnappers, and a man utterly convinced his love was the exception to every rule that came before him, the Sentinelese haven't fallen behind the modern world. They've simply refused to join it. And so far, against everything history has thrown at that decision, they've won every single time. Consider the sheer range of what's tried to break through in 2.5 centuries. A British Empire that controlled a quarter of the globe. A cargo ship's worth of raw iron delivered by accident. A film crew backed by one of the most respected scientific institutions on Earth. A trained anthropologist willing to stand unarmed in open water and take an arrow rather than retreat. A missionary convinced his God was personally directing his footsteps. Every single one of them, in their own way, represented the full weight of what the modern world considers unstoppable: technology, science, faith, force, patience, love. None of it was enough to move the line the Sentinelese drew for themselves 10,000 years ago. And maybe that's the real reason this story keeps resurfacing every few years, retold, reposted, rewatched. It's not really about a remote island or a dangerous tribe. It's about the one thing modern civilization has almost completely lost the ability to imagine. A group of people who looked at everything we call progress, medicine, government, religion, connectivity, convenience, and generation after generation said no. Not out of ignorance, because ignorance doesn't survive 250 years of direct, repeated, often violent contact with the very thing it supposedly doesn't understand. Out of choice, defended with the only currency they've ever needed: absolute, unwavering consistency. We are, whether we like it or not, the outsiders in this story. Every single account here, the shipwrecked sailors, the kidnapped children, the anthropologists, the missionary, comes from our side of the water. We have never once heard this story told from inside that tree line, in their own words, on their own terms. And under the current policy, protecting both them and whatever remains of their world, we almost certainly never will. That silence isn't a gap in the story. At this point, it might be the entire point of it. Somewhere on a strip of white sand less than an hour's flight from a 5-star hotel, fires are still burning tonight that no outsider has ever sat beside. And maybe, after everything this island has taught us, the most respectful thing left to do with that mystery is let it stay exactly that. A mystery, guarded exactly the way its people have always wanted it guarded, completely, permanently, and on their terms alone.